Can an airplane really serve for 100 years? The mighty B-52 Stratofortress, better known as the Buff, might be the first to pull it off. This 8-engine giant first flew in 1952, and the newest one rolled off the assembly line all the way back in 1962. And that's back when Kennedy was still president. Over the decades, the B-52 has become so iconic that it's carved out a place not just in military history, but in pop culture itself. And part of its staying power comes down to something no designer could have predicted: the fortunate timing of world events, evolving missions, and shifting technologies that kept making the Buff the right answer again and again. So how and why can this Cold War bomber that's already pushing 75 years old still be flying combat missions? What makes it so special? And how long will the Air Force keep flying and upgrading this massive deliverer of steel rain from the sky? In today's video, we're going to unpack the origins of this bomber, why it keeps outlasting every aircraft meant to replace it, and when the final Buff sortie will be flown. So strap in, because this isn't your granddaddy's Buff. This is the story of a legend that just might outlive us all. PilotPhotog.com. Without a doubt, the B-52 has defied every expectation placed upon it. But things didn't start out well for the Stratofortress, and we'll get into that in a moment. Known for generations of air crews as the Buff, short for big, ugly, fat, the nickname reflects the aircraft's unmistakable shape and enormous presence. Yet, what that nickname also reveals is its affection, respect, and a touch of awe. After all, few aircraft can claim to have changed the course of wars, shaped deterrence strategy for decades, and survived long enough to receive a complete technological rebirth. The designers who dreamed up what would become the B-52 had no idea just how long their creation would fly. So let's go all the way back to the beginning to see how we got here. The story of what would become the B-52 begins in 1946, just after World War II, when tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were rising fast. The US Army Air Forces knew that the next war would not be fought with propeller bombers. They needed something new, something that could take off from American soil, fly halfway across the world, deliver nuclear payload, and return home without landing overseas. Other bombers like the B-29 and the B-50 no longer had the range. Even the enormous B-36 Peacemaker, a hybrid prop and jet aircraft, was becoming vulnerable to Soviet jet interceptors. And while the Peacemaker had the range, it didn't have the speed. I've done an entire video on the Peacemaker, check it out after this one, link below. Because of the advances in Soviet air defenses, the United States needed a bomber that could fly higher, faster, farther, and carry more weapons than anything that had existed before it. But the B-52 didn't come from nowhere. The roots of the Stratofortress actually reach back to the B-47 Stratojet, which Boeing began designing in 1943 and refined through the end of World War II. By 1946, the B-47's final swept-wing potted engine layout was set. And when it first flew in 1947, it proved that this radical new approach to jet bombers actually worked. Today, the B-47 is a largely forgotten bomber, despite over 2,000 examples having been built. Even as the Stratojet was ramping up to become the next bomber, Boeing had already begun sketching the earliest versions of the B-52 back in 1946. But the problem was, many designers were stuck in the propeller days. Those first turboprop concepts quickly fell behind the pace of aviation, since the jet age was in full swing by this time. As the B-47 test flights in 1947 and 1948 validated swept wings and the bicycle landing gear, the B-52 program did what any good design team does. They pivoted, but there was some resistance. Inside Boeing, you could feel the tension between the old school engineers who trusted the familiar heartbeat of propellers and the new generation pushing for sleek, swept-wing jet bombers that looked like they belonged to a different century. The effort to build the biggest, fastest, longest range bomber appeared to be stuck in a quagmire. Then came the all-nighter that changed everything. In 1948, a small team of Boeing engineers gathered for a late-night design session that has since become legend among aircraft historians. After countless sketches, proposals, counterproposals, and likely many arguments throughout the night, the team had arrived at a final design. It was literally a sketch on a piece of paper. Now, they took some of those early lessons from the B-47 while leaping far beyond them. The team had sketched out a bold new concept: 8 jet engines grouped into 4 twin pods mounted under long, swept wings. That rough drawing, penciled out after hours of debate and revision, promised greater speed, higher ceilings, massive fuel capacity, and marked the birth of the B-52's iconic layout. But the challenges were only beginning for the Boeing team. Switching to a fully jet-powered aircraft introduced major engineering obstacles. Jet engines consumed fuel at high rates, and that forced Boeing to design wings that were capable of supporting enormous fuel capacity without sacrificing performance. The wings were made long and highly flexible to provide lift and reduce drag, but their flexibility created challenges on the ground. Traditional landing gear would risk wing strikes. So Boeing took that same bicycle-style landing gear that also had small outrigger wheels at the tips from the B-47. Engineers also had to integrate advanced navigation systems, bombing computers, and communication equipment suitable for missions that would last many hours. The process required continuous innovation in aerodynamics, structure, and avionics. And this resulted in an aircraft that broke new ground in aviation design. After months of designing and trial and error, it was time to test that design in the ultimate proving ground, an actual test flight, which was planned for the XB-52. When the day of the first flight of the Stratofortress came, it was not to be the XB-52. While designed and planned to fly first, a hydraulic failure on the runway prevented the XB-52 from taking off. And so the milestone was shifted to the YB-52. That's when, on 15 April 1952, Boeing test pilot Tex Johnson, yes, the same Tex Johnson that would barrel roll the 707 prototype, along with Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Guy Townsend, lifted the YB-52 into the air for a nearly 3-hour flight that immediately validated the aircraft's design. Despite its size and 8-engine layout, the bomber climbed smoothly and responded with surprising agility, confirming that the swept wing configuration worked as intended. Those early test flights that followed focused on evaluating engine performance, fuel flow, wing flexibility, and the behavior of the bicycle-style landing gear, which forced pilots to think ahead about crosswinds and landing attitude. And that came straight out of the B-47's playbook. In many ways, the Buff wasn't a clean break from the past, but a refined, supersized evolution of Boeing's earlier Stratojet design. Seriously, like a famous comedian, the Stratojet just doesn't get any respect. In the years that followed, the B-52 evolved quickly. Each variant refined the bomber and pushed it closer to the aircraft we know today. Let's walk through that evolution now. It all began, of course, in 1951 with that XB-52 prototype. That introduced the swept wing layout and the 8-engine configuration. Then came the YB-52 in 1952, which, as we've seen, was the first to fly and validated the entire concept. In 1954, we got the B-52A. This added a side-by-side cockpit and aerial refueling capability. By 1955, we got the B-52B, which was the first fully operational model and became the backbone of early nuclear deterrence. A strengthened fuselage and larger fuel tanks for longer range gave us the B-52C, which was introduced in 1956. Now the B-52D came next, and this is an interesting one. While it was first introduced in 1956, it was further modified in 1966, just in time for the Vietnam War. The 1966 modifications included Project Big Belly, which allowed the Buff to carry massive conventional bombs. More on that in a moment. Getting back to the variants, after the B-52D came the E model in 1957, which introduced better navigation and bombing systems. Following that came the B-52F in 1958, and that introduced upgraded engines for hotter climates and improved reliability. The B-52G introduced some interesting modifications. First flown in 1959, it incorporated a shorter vertical tail because Boeing discovered that the earlier tall tail design created structural and stability problems at high speeds and low altitudes. Now, as Soviet defenses improved during the Cold War, the Buff had shifted into low-level penetration missions. This required the bomber to fly fast and skim the terrain to avoid radar. With the original tail fin, it just simply flexed too much and was vulnerable to turbulence and gust loads. After all, the airflow down in the weeds was brutal, and that big vertical tail acted like a giant sail. So Boeing redesigned it with a shorter vertical stabilizer, which reduced bending forces and structural stress. Along with that, they went ahead and added a stronger, redesigned structure that was better suited for high-speed, low-altitude flight. And that gave the Buff improved handling and survivability, especially if the aircraft lost an engine. And of course, that now distinct shortened tail was less elegant maybe, but it was far better suited for the nuclear strike tactics of its era. And then came the B-52H, introduced in 1961. This variant added the TF-33 turbofan engines, which had reduced fuel burn and gave the Buff improved range. This is actually the variant that's still flying to this day. Alright, now that we've walked through the whole Buff lineup, let's get into what really matters. What this airplane actually did out in the world, and how it earned its reputation one mission at a time. Along the way, we'll point out the moments of luck and timing that help keep the Buff in service long after anyone expected. The first operational mission of the Stratofortress took place soon after it entered service in 1955. It was actually the B-52B which conducted its first major long-range operational readiness mission back in early 1956. This marked the beginning of the Buff's career as America's primary airborne nuclear deterrent. Those initial missions were designed to test the bomber's ability to execute intercontinental nuclear delivery profiles, which meant flying thousands of miles, completing multiple aerial refuelings, and navigating over long distances at high altitudes. And even though the aircraft didn't drop weapons in its first mission, it was treated as the Buff's true operational debut because it validated the core requirement the bomber was built for. Engineers and crews evaluated fuel flow accuracy, radar navigation performance, engine reliability, and long-duration flight characteristics. These results confirmed that the B-52 could reach global targets directly from the United States, something that most earlier bombers could not accomplish without forward staging bases. Furthermore, this first large-scale mission reassured military planners that the Stratofortress could maintain a credible nuclear strike capability. And remember, this was in an era when long-range ballistic missiles were still in their infancy. The ability of the B-52 to carry a heavy payload across continents was critical. From this point onward, the aircraft became the backbone of Strategic Air Command's nuclear alert rotations, often standing on the ramp fully fueled, armed, and ready to launch with almost no warning. But the B-52 did more than fly demo runs. Over the decades, a handful of pivotal missions carved its place into airpower history. One of the earliest and most dramatic was Operation Chrome Dome, which kicked off in 1960. This highly ambitious, grueling Cold War operation taxed both crews and airframes to the limit. B-52s were armed with nuclear weapons and flew continuous airborne alert routes, keeping a literal round-the-clock deterrent in the sky. These flights would ensure that a portion of the United States nuclear deterrent force was always airborne and therefore immune to a surprise attack. Now you can imagine, these operations required incredible endurance from the aircraft and the crews, and it demonstrated the Buff's ability to remain airborne for long periods. But the operation was not without its setbacks, and in one case, disaster. In 1966, a major accident occurred during a Chrome Dome mission near Palomares, Spain. A Buff collided with a KC-135 tanker during refueling, releasing several nuclear bombs over land and sea. Although none of the bombs thankfully detonated, the accident triggered significant shifts in nuclear alert policy. Continuous airborne alert missions were eventually discontinued to reduce risk. But as the Cold War wore on and the space race was in full swing, intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, became more effective and numerous. With the prevailing missile theory of the late 50s and early 60s, it started to look like the Buff's days were numbered. But then, the first in a series of lucky breaks came to the B-52. In 1965, with the Vietnam War picking up steam, the Stratofortress would be converted to drop conventional or iron bombs. This effort became known as Operation Arclight and was intended to support ground troops and interdict enemy supply networks by dropping tons of bombs. The B-52Ds that were involved were modified under the Big Belly program, which greatly enhanced its already enormous bomb capacity. These missions changed the battlefield by delivering heavy firepower precisely, or at least more or less, where the troops needed it. And you could argue that the Buff's most intense and historically significant mission of the Vietnam War occurred in 1972 during Operation Linebacker 2. Also known as the Christmas bombings, this 11-day campaign involved concentrated airstrikes against strategic military and industrial targets in North Vietnam. But it wasn't without cost. During Linebacker 2, the Buff suffered losses that were mostly due to predictable routes, yet the operation ultimately achieved its objective. By adjusting their tactics, the B-52 crews were able to carry out their remaining missions more effectively. Those B-52 strikes and overwhelming firepower pressured North Vietnam to return to the negotiating table, ultimately contributing to the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. Linebacker 2, along with the Buff's nuclear capability, cemented the Stratofortress as one of the most influential strategic aircraft of the Cold War. Later, the aircraft would continue to prove its relevance in modern wars. For example, during Operation Desert Storm in 1991, B-52Gs flew one of the longest combat missions in aviation history, launching from Barksdale Air Force Base, striking targets in Iraq, and returning home 35 hours later. Can you just imagine that jet lag? The Buff delivered a substantial portion of all bombs dropped during the conflict. In fact, when Stratofortresses would show up to drop their steel rain during the first Gulf War, it had a definite psychological impact. Many Iraqi units chose to surrender after experiencing the shockwaves that were produced by high-altitude B-52 strikes. The aircraft's long endurance and ability to release massive bomb loads made it a decisive asset during the campaign. In 1999, the Stratofortress took place in Operation Allied Force, using precision-guided bombs against Serbian military targets, demonstrating its adaptation to modern precision strike warfare. And say what you want about the Buff's lack of stealth, there were no B-52s shot down in that campaign, unlike the F-117. Sorry, Nighthawk, we still love you though. During the early 2000s, the Buff would evolve and then demonstrate its evolution into a precision strike platform. With JDAM guided bombs, the aircraft would hit fortified mountain locations, cave networks, and enemy command centers. Its long loiter capability and range allowed it to support troops on the ground by delivering rapid and accurate fire when needed. More specifically, the Stratofortress would play crucial roles in Operation Enduring Freedom in 2001 and Operation Iraqi Freedom, or the Second Gulf War, in 2003. And also during Operation Inherent Resolve, which spanned from 2015 to 2019. In both those campaigns, the B-52 showed again and again that long-range, persistent air support was possible, while also delivering those precision weapons against insurgent targets. These missions highlighted how the Stratofortress remained adaptable through successive generations of warfare. Now, so far, we've mostly highlighted the Buff's conventional weapons, but what about its nuclear capability? The B-52 has been tasked with this role almost since its beginning in the 1950s, and surprisingly, it still maintains that role to this day. And once again, it's been because of a little bit of timing and luck. Let's go back to the early 1960s. The Air Force is pouring its hope into the sleek, needle-nosed B-58 Hustler. It's faster than anything else with a crew cabin, Mach 2 speeds, polished aluminum, and more cutting-edge engineering than the Buff had ever dreamed of. The Hustler looked like the future, yet it was expensive to maintain, temperamental to fly, and carried a nuclear payload that demanded perfection in an imperfect world. Meanwhile, the B-52 just kept lumbering along. It could haul more bombs, stay airborne longer, and operate from more bases with far less fuss. Within a decade, the Hustler was retired, and the Buff remained proven, reliable, and already adapting to new missions. Then came the B-70 Valkyrie, a bomber so futuristic it looked like it belonged on the cover of a pulp sci-fi magazine. Designed to scream through the stratosphere at Mach 3, it promised to make everything that came before it obsolete, including the B-52. But the world changed faster than the program could keep up. Soviet air defenses evolved, surface-to-air missiles rendered extreme altitude bombing suicidal basically, and the B-70's cost became impossible to justify. The Valkyrie died on the drawing board, with only 2 prototypes ever built and 1 destroyed in a tragic accident. Once again, the old Buff, slow, steady, and adaptable, was still on the ramp, still flying, and still relevant. And then there's the B-1 Lancer. After being initially cancelled, it finally entered service in the mid-1980s, and it was supposed to shoulder the nuclear deterrence mission that had been the B-52's bread and butter since the Cold War began. But the B-1 fully never replaced the Buff. Fortunately for the Buff and unfortunately for the Lancer, the Soviets really feared the B-1. Because of this, arms control treaties specifically called out the B-1, and the Lancer would go on to lose its nuclear mission entirely. The B-52, on the other hand, kept its place in the nuclear triad, carrying cruise missiles, nukes, maintaining alert status, and evolving with every generation of standoff weapon. In a twist no one expected, the younger jet had handed the crown right back to its elder. But what about the B-2 Spirit? Well, while the Spirit is nuclear capable and stealthy on levels that the B-52 could only ever dream of, the B-2 was itself a victim of bad timing. Being unveiled at the very end of the Cold War, the B-2's production was severely cut short to pay the peace dividend. With only 21 examples ever built, the B-2 became the surgical strike weapon for very specific and sensitive operations, while the B-52 would just continue to shoulder the majority of the airborne nuclear threat. Through it all, the rise and fall of faster, sleeker, more advanced bombers, the B-52 survived not because it was the most glamorous, but because it was the most useful. Adaptable, affordable, reliable. Just like your granddaddy's pickup truck. The bomber that was supposed to be temporary became the bomber that outlived everything built to replace it. And it's still not done. Many B-52 missions never appeared in public reports, but were essential to national security. During the Cold War, some of these aircraft would conduct electronic reconnaissance, ocean surveillance, radar mapping flights, and other efforts to support intelligence gathering. These missions helped identify early emerging threats and redefine targeting strategies. Now, it wasn't always about flying high and fast. Low-altitude penetration training in the 1970s and 1980s would prepare crews for nuclear strike scenarios by teaching them how to fly very low to avoid radar detection. These intense training missions were physically demanding and required precise flying skills. The Buff has also performed show-of-force passes in Afghanistan and Iraq, where its presence alone often caused enemy forces to retreat or disperse. But what if I told you that the Buff was also a scientist? The B-52's legacy goes far beyond bombing. The Stratofortress has contributed significantly to aerospace research. It has served as a launch platform for the X-15 rocket plane, which supported hypersonic and spaceflight experiments that shaped early American space exploration. It's also performed mine laying, maritime patrol, and communications relay missions. Now, more recently, the B-52 has taken part in hypersonic missile testing and new radar system trials. Its large airframe and excellent endurance make it ideal for carrying large experimental payloads and advanced weapons. And now, here's the thing. If all the B-52s were grounded tomorrow and never flew again, it would still be one of the most important aircraft ever to fly. But what if I told you the Buff may be halfway through its service life? Right now, the Air Force is deep into the biggest upgrade the bomber has seen since it first flew. New Rolls-Royce F-130 engines are set to replace those smoky TF-33s. This will give the B-52 more range, better fuel efficiency, and modern reliability. A brand new ASA radar, which is derived from the same tech flying in frontline fighters, will overhaul targeting and situational awareness. Updated avionics, digital displays, and new communication suites are bringing the cockpit well into the 21st century. And looking ahead, the Buff is being wired for the next generation of standoff weapons. Hypersonic systems like the Wave Rider, along with smart cruise missiles, will help keep it relevant in a high-end conflict. When all these upgrades come together, we're not just extending the Buff's life, we're transforming it into a modern missile truck designed to operate well into the 2050s and possibly beyond. Now, you're probably wondering where the B-21 Raider fits into all of this. Well, surprisingly, it does and it doesn't. You see, the Raider, a 6th generation bomber, is set to replace the B-2 Spirit, and in much greater numbers. While today there are only 19 active B-2s, the Pentagon plans on purchasing between 100 to 200 Raiders. But these are meant to replace the B-2, not the B-52, at least not at first. The Buff will continue to serve not as a deep penetrating bomber meant to fly into heavily defended airspace, but as a standoff platform that can lob insane amounts of firepower at long ranges. Hypersonic missiles like the Wave Rider come to mind. What other modern standoff weapons or drones could the B-52 carry? Comment below. So how long would the B-52 fly? Before we answer that, we need to look at how those who have flown, served aboard, or maintained the Buff remember it. A rugged, get-the-job-done kind of an aircraft. Pilots have described it as dependable and predictable, while ground crews respected its straightforward design and mechanical resilience. For decades, commanders have valued the Buff because it has always delivered results. The Buff is much more than just a military aircraft. It's now actually embedded in American culture. It's appeared in films, documentaries, museums, air shows, and veteran stories. There's even a band that's been named after the airplane, and they sing songs about lobsters and tin roof shacks. Maybe you've heard of them. At the end of the day, the B-52 will be remembered as a machine that defined, then outlived eras, shaped strategic thinking, and influenced generations of pilots and aircraft designers. Even as the B-21 Raider rises to eventually take to the forefront, the legacy of the B-52 will remain unshaken. It will be remembered as the bomber that carried the weight of decades, adapted to every mission, and earned its place among the greatest aircraft ever built. And to finally answer that question, how long will the B-52 serve? Well, here's my bold prediction. When the last B-21 Raider is finally retired, decades from now, a pair of B-52s will overfly the ceremony and remind everyone who their great-granddaddy is. Now you know. PilotPhotog.com